As we continue in the book of Exodus this week, we are going to encounter one of the keystones for the culture of the Israelites. There are three things that really define who the Israelites are as they come into the promised land and establish their nation. One of those things is the land. We aren't going to encounter yet the promised land per se, as they're still in the wilderness. The second thing is going to be the temple. We're not going to get to the temple until we get to the days of Solomon, but we will get into something next week that is a precursor to the temple. But today we get the third element that is foundational to them, that is the law. The law comes to define who the Israelites are, because this law is going to determine their whole livelihood, not just their religious identity, but the way that they deal with one another in a legal way, in a social way, in all of the other arenas of life. We have in this section of Exodus one of the great first law codes of ancient civilization. And it is, of course, founded upon the Ten Commandments, which continue to be a foundation for legal systems in our own country and in countries around the world. But even though some of the things in the Ten Commandments have become legal per se, they are not morally allowable still under God's law. The Ten Commandments remain the foundation for God's law, even into the New Testament. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first of all, the Israelites receive the law because they have this powerful encounter with God at this mountain called Sinai. Now, Sinai is traditionally considered the same mountain as Horeb. A lot of times you'll hear scholars say that Sinai is one face of the mountain and Horeb is the other face of the mountain, and it just depends on which direction you're approaching the mountain from. Horeb is where Moses encountered Yahweh in the burning bush. And so he's coming back to where this whole event that inspired the Exodus happened. And he is now having another powerful encounter with God. If you'll remember, God told him that one of the signs would be that he would come back and worship on that mountain. So he's here, that sign has been fulfilled. But instead of it being just a personal experience, then he's experiencing it with the community of the Israelites. In the experience of the Israelites with God at Sinai, we get two images of God that at first might seem contradictory, but really they're two images that we must hold in tension even today as we experience God in the 21st century. First of all, we get this image of an all-powerful, awesome, mighty God that cannot be approached. The people tell Moses, "We do not want to approach God. You speak to God for us. We don't want to speak to him or hear him speak to us." They were afraid by all the signs that accompanied the event on Sinai. The thunder, the fire, the cloud, the booming voice. All of these things were fearful or fear-inducing. And so they said, this God who is awesome and mighty and far above and beyond us, we want him to stay far beyond us, keep his distance. But then we have this very intimate picture of God who will converse with Moses, as one will read later, as one converses with a friend. And so we get this very imminent, close, personal, relational God. And we still have to hold those two things in tension. God is the transcendent God above heaven and earth who rules over us in power and might. And yet God is also the one that we can approach, the one who wants to know us and be known by us. And we can't throw one of them out and just focus on the other. They have to both be given equal representation in our faith and our understanding of God. So let's move now to the Ten Commandments and look at how vital these commandments are, even today, to our understanding of God. First of all, the first four commandments have to deal with our relationship with God. Specifically, don't have any other gods before me. Do not make any graven images or idols. Do not misuse the name of the Lord, and respect and honor the day that the Lord has set aside for Sabbath. These are all directly connected to how we as individuals and as a community of faith connect with God. And then the last six all have to do with our connection, our relationships with other people. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not commit adultery or covet. These have to do with the interpersonal relationships that we have with our neighbor. And so this is reinforced by Jesus when he says that the two greatest commandments are to love God and to love our neighbor. That is already reflected in the Ten Commandments that we see here in Exodus chapter 20. Like I mentioned earlier, some of these laws in the Ten Commandments used to have actual legal ramifications even in our society. If you were born in the 20th century, like I was, then some of these were on the books still that are not on the books anymore. For instance, honoring the Sabbath. We used to have blue laws in the United States that on Sundays you could not open your place of business on a Sunday. Adultery used to be actually illegal according to the legal code of the United States. So some of these things are not legal anymore or illegal anymore in the United States. Some of them are. Of course, we're still called by our civil code not to murder, not to steal, not to lie when we're giving witness, not to perjure ourselves. But whether these things are legal or not in a societal sense, we need to remember that God still holds these moral laws to be foundational and important for all people of faith. It's sort of like Paul says later on in the New Testament. He says, not everything is illegal, or he says, all things may be legal, but not all things are beneficial. Not all things build up and help us to be people of faith. So even if our society has moved away some from these laws, let's not forget that God still calls people of faith to live according to the Ten Commandments. One of the struggles we may have with the Ten Commandments, though, is that so many of them are expressed in a negative sense. Do not this, do not do that. And I think it's helpful sometimes to think of them in a positive sense, or in telling us what we should do or how we should live. That's one of the transitions that Jesus makes when he tells us to follow the two laws of loving God and loving neighbor, and how all of the other laws will be encompassed by those two laws. And so several years ago, I got to thinking about this, and I took the Ten Commandments and I rewrote them, not to change the meaning of them, but to put them in a positive sense. These are things we should do. This is what I came away with as I looked at the Ten Commandments. For the first commandment, to remember that Yahweh alone is God. For the second one, worship Yahweh in spirit and truth. Obviously, worshiping with idols is not worshiping in truth. And Jesus tells us in John's Gospel to worship in spirit and truth. For the third commandment, honor the name of Yahweh in all things that you do. So it's not just not saying certain words that would take the Lord's name in vain, but honor the name of Yahweh in all that you do as a person of faith. The fourth one, observe the Sabbath. The fifth one, honor your father and mother. That is how it's expressed in the original Ten Commandments. For the sixth commandment, honor all life, because you can technically not murder or not kill, but not honor life. We're going to see that here in just a second as we look at Jesus' interpretation of the Ten Commandments and the laws. For the seventh commandment, honor your marriage vows. Again, you cannot commit adultery and still not honor your spouse in other ways. So this is, from a more positive sense, honor your marriage vows. The eighth one, instead of do not steal, share God's blessings. Be a person of generosity. For the ninth commandment, be truthful. Not just don't lie, but be a person of integrity. Be a person who lives on truth. And then finally, for the 10th one, be content with what God has given you. That's a big message for Paul in the book of Philippians. And it really speaks to not just not having a covetous heart, but to really being thankful and grateful for what God has given you and done in your life. Once we move past the Ten Commandments, though, we get into these other laws which seem somewhat problematic for us in a 21st century mindset. We see laws about concerning slavery. We see laws concerning stoning children who disobey their parents. Things that seem not just antiquated to us, but things that seem wrong. things that seem to go against our moral code that Jesus has set for us and the Holy Spirit has led us into. Even in a sense, seem to contradict the Ten Commandments that we just were reading. And so how do we deal with this? Well, first of all, we have to understand that the law, when we say law, capital L law, in the Old Testament, we're talking about several different kinds of laws. There is the moral law that is founded on the Ten Commandments that we continue to keep today. There are the societal or lifestyle laws. Those have to do with specific cultural elements of that time period and the people in that general area, how the Israelites would have understood culture through their encounters with the Egyptians for 400 years and then their eventual encounters with the Canaanites. And we'll talk more about that in future videos. But those lifestyle laws, they contain things like the laws against eating pork, the laws against wearing mixed thread clothing, things like that. Those laws have passed away as we've gone into the New Testament time. They're not the same weight as the moral law. And we have to remember not to normalize our culture or their culture in the sense that culturally based laws are relevant for those cultures in which they have arisen in. But that culture is not necessarily right or wrong, or 100% right or 100% wrong. They're culturally based, and cultures change over time. Well, again, we'll talk about that more in future videos. And then you had the priestly laws, which we haven't gotten into yet, or the sacrificial laws, which the book of Hebrews says that Jesus has fulfilled all of those, and we no longer have to keep those sacrificial laws, which I'm thankful for, meaning that we don't have to sacrifice sheep and bulls on the altar in the church. So those laws have been, we've been released from those through what Jesus has done in the New Testament. But still, what about these laws that tell us about how we should treat slaves, or if we purchase slaves, or if we are disobedient to our parents, or people who are caught in certain sins being stoned and given capital punishment? How do we deal with those today? Are they all culturally bound? Do they have some moral seed within them, a little kernel of truth that we need to explore? Let's take a look at what Jesus has to say in those instances. Let's take one of these laws specifically as our example. If you look in Exodus chapter 21, and starting in verse 23, you get this part of the Israelite law. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. Well, Jesus has something very specific to say about that law and gives us an insight on how to treat some of these laws that may be more culturally bound, and what is Jesus' expectation for us now as New Testament people. We have to go forward to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 to see Jesus deal with some of these expectations of the culture of the Israelites all the way up until his day. Jesus, first of all, says this in Matthew 5:17. He says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill." And this makes sense for us, especially in the sacrificial priestly laws. He fulfilled those. And in the dietary laws, which he later tells through the vision to Peter that we no longer have to keep those dietary laws either. He's fulfilled all of those laws that are culturally based. But he goes on then to give these different statements where he says, "You have heard it said blank, and now I say to you blank." And this follows a pattern throughout the Sermon on the Mount. And he's, in all these instances, giving either an example from the Old Testament law or an example from the Old Testament law with a little bit extra. But what he is saying is not that these laws should be relaxed, but actually we should look at these laws a little more stringently. For instance, He says in verse 21, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. And so what he's saying here is, it's not enough just to keep the letter of the law. You need to keep the spirit of the law. You cannot murder someone, but you can murder their reputation, or you can talk poorly about them and it will affect the way others see them. Or you can just treat them harshly and meanly, unkindly, without actually murdering them, but you are hurting their heart. You are hurting them on the inside, and that's just as serious. Jesus is saying, don't use the moral law as a way to excuse lesser behavior. That's one way to look at it. He then talks about the same thing with adultery and with making oaths, that it's not just enough not to do those things, but you need to be faithful in all ways to your spouse. You need to keep your word and not make oaths, but you need to just speak the truth in all times. But then he says this. He says in verse 38, you have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. In this instance, Jesus is taking an actual law or command from the law that we see in Exodus. He's quoting it verbatim, and he's saying, I want you to live differently than that now. Here's the way we understand the law today, the law from Exodus. Was it affirmed in the life and work of Jesus Christ? If it was, then it's still relevant for us today. If Jesus taught us a way to live, a law of the Spirit that is different from what we read in the Old Testament law, then we can understand that that was a law that was culturally bound for the people of Israel in that time period, in that place, in that culture. Like I said, we'll talk more about that in future videos. And instead, we are to live the way that Jesus Christ led us to live. Again, this is not a way to let us off the hook of anything. It's the way to make sure that we are fulfilling the law as Jesus fulfilled it and as he interpreted it and as he intended it to be for all time, for all people, and for all places.